All right, Rabbosai, good morning. Let us begin. Baruch Hashem, beginning by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. To thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors, Dr. Linda Weinberg, Sarah and Ricky Gratz, Julia, Rena, and Eve, in loving memory of their father, husband, and Zayda, Dr. Paul Weinberg, Paris Moshe Ben Avram, Ayal and Sara Steinberg, in the susha refuah shelema for shulamis Bas susha, and Adam Ben Yudit in the zechus of our tefillos being miskabel. Our week of learning sponsors, Ira Miriam Grossman, in creation of the yahrzeit of Melech ben Azriel, and Avram Zysman, creation of the yahrzeit of his mother, Ziva Bas Avraham. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah, the families ein nechama, and we thank all of our mishpachos for their sponsorships and generosity. I will say today's daf is daf kuf 100. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Tzadik Tes Amud Beis. A lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. Sorry. Okay, we are picking up on Tzadik Tes 99b. And we are picking up, we left off yesterday in the interesting machlokes regard. A little closer. Try to pass. Is it maybe the font on that on the panel thing there? The right button. I think if you turn it towards the right, the volume goes up. From what I've been told. Better. No? Okay, I'll just keep it closer. Good, thank you. All right, so on Tzadik Tes, thank you, Sammy. On 99b, so we left off with the interesting machlokes regarding if a person goes ahead and says to his shaliach, the acher v'lo l'shnayim. He says to his shaliach, sell it to one person, not to two people. So everyone agrees that if the shaliach goes in and sells it to two people, then halacha l'maisa, the sale is invalid. What happens if he just said sell it to one person, but he wasn't explicit about not selling it to two? So there we have a machlokes. Rav Huna says still, to one means to one and not to two. Rav Chisda says to one just means to one. So you can sell it to many more than one as well. So we then saw a story of Rav Nachman, but let's pick up. We are picking up 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20. Okay, probably count from the top. 21 lines up from the bottom. Amrulay. V'amar mar ein ona lekarkos. Shabbos says they say back to Rav Nachman. Remember again, this was Rav Chisda and Rav Bar Avuna by Rav Nachman in Surah. So they said to Rav Nachman, you taught us that in ona bekarkos. We learned this concept yesterday, that there is no idea of overcharging when it comes to karka. Hani milihecha de ta balabais. Shabbos said, this is true. When do we say ein ona bekarkos? That's when the balabais, the owner of the karka, charges more, charges less. However, aval ta shliach, but if the shliach makes a mistake in the way that he goes in and he sells the land, Amrale, the balabayis, the grantor could say, the principal could say, the takuni shadarti chavalo la'abusi. I sent you to help me out and not to compromise me. Uminat temra, the shani bein shliach la'balabayis. We'll say in general, how do we see that there is a distinction between the shaliach and the balabayis? Where do we see that concept? So it's actually very interesting. What the Gemara is essentially advancing is the idea that perhaps when I am selling my own land, there's a margin of error. Or I should say there's a margin of error that's acceptable, that doesn't void the transaction. Yet when the shaliach goes ahead and is supposed to execute an agency, there is no margin of error. So where do we see that concept? So the Gemara says, here we go. Disnan ha'omer l'shluchot say v'taru. I say to a shaliach, tithe my produce for me. Okay, so what's the halacha? Torim kidas balabais. The halacha is that the shaliach has to figure out what, or I should say, torim kidas balabais means the shaliach is obligated to tithe the produce as I would have tithed the produce. If you look at Rashi is almost right across from Rashi. Torim kidas balabais kafi mashu makir bo im ayin yofa echad me'arboim im ayin ra echad mishishim. So we'll say it's actually very interesting. When it comes to tithing, there are different levels of tithing. Sometimes people tithe generously, that's 1/40. Sometimes people tithe a little bit miserly, okay, not generously, right? That's 1/60. And then there's a midah beinonis, which is 1/50. I tell my shaliach, take tithe from my produce. What don't I tell the shaliach? What don't I tell him? How much? So in that case, the shaliach has the leverage to go out, or has the maneuverability to tithe in accordance with what he thinks my tithing patterns are. What happens if ultimately the shaliach does not know how much I would tithe? Torim bebenonis, echa mechamishim. In that case, he takes the middle road, 1/50th. Piches asara ha'osif asara. If he veers by a tenth in either direction. In other words, so the idea is if you don't know what the balabayis would tithe, go with a 50th. If you end up doing a 40th or a 60th, ultimately again, truma so truma. Ultimately it works. So we'll say, what do you see from there? That a balabay, that even a shaliach does have a range, right? There is some level of flexibility by definition in mishlichos. Ve'ilu gabe balabayis, yet balabayis, it says, Tanya, Taram va'ala biyada afilu echam esrim, truma so truma. Yet Rabbi say, interestingly enough, balabayis, if you scoop up produce, and you say, okay, I'm scooping up truma, and it turns out that you scooped up what? 1/20th, ultimately the truma designation is still valid. Now, Rabbi said, leaving aside the balabayis case, the point over here is you see that a shaliach does have flexibility. That was the word. Flexibility. Right? There is flexibility for a shaliach, and even if he deviates a little bit from what the balabayis wanted him to do, the shlichus is still effective. So to which the Gemara says, Tashma, Kesuvos arba me'ozuz. Fine. So Tashma, Kesuvos arba me'ozuz. Machro lezevamana ula achron shavimana v'dinar b'mana shal achron batal v'shal kula michran kayim. So we'll say, so yet again, so on one hand you're showing me here about truma that the shaliach has some level of flexibility. Yet we keep coming back to the same case in the Mishnah. A woman who has a ksuva for 400 zuz, she sells off parcel 1 for 100, parcel 2 for 100, parcel 3 for 100. And then what happens? She gets to parcel 4. Parcel 4 is what? Worth 101 zuz. She sells it for 100. What's the halacha? The last transaction is batal. So I will say, so ultimately, Vishal Kulan Chaim, and yet look at Rashi, Tashma Kesuvos v'afushe shtari kapeida. So now the Gemara is just going back for just a second. So I will say, so we're jumping back and forth a little bit. So the Gemara just got finished essentially saying that halacha l'maisa, even by shlichos, there's some level of flexibility. Now we're jumping back to the ksuva case. Now, if you remember again, we had another case in yesterday's daf. What was yesterday's case? That let's say I tell the shaliach, I want you to go ahead and sell 2 acres. The shaliach sells 1 acre. So remember again, the shaliach said, why did he only sell 1 acre? Why did he sell 1 acre? Because again, once you sell land, that's it. And even though I'm strapped for cash, he said, you know what, sell 1 parcel at a time. What do I posit back to the shaliach? What do I say back to him? I say, I don't want to have to maintain so many different shtaros, so many different documents. So I'll say, what was the halacha there? So now the Gemara is jumping back to that case for just a moment. Interestingly enough, the Gemara says we're dealing over here with a woman who's owed 400 zuz by the Yisomim. And so essentially, what do they tell her? They tell her, go sell off 400 zuz of land. So what does she do? She sells 1 parcel, 2 parcels, 3 parcels, 4 parcels. But one second, from the Yisomim's perspective, this is not good because now there's multiple shtaros. And yet you see that the transaction stands. There's only a problem with the last transaction because she undersells a piece of property. But clearly you see that we're not worried about the proliferation of shtaros, to which the Gemara says, Amrav Shishri Ravidi, Bikatini. No, that case is different. Why? Because there's no choice. We're not talking about one contiguous large tract of land that she's selling off piecemeal. Rather, what are we talking about? Multiple smaller pieces of land. Okay, Shabbos say that is the end of the sugya. So first of all, halacha l'maisa, how do we paskin? Shabbos say, so the Rambam writes in Hilchos Shluchin v'Shutvin in Parak Aleph Halacha Daled. Very quickly, listen to this. Ha'omer l'shlucho mecharli misada sheli beis sa u'machalo beis sasayim. So remember again, what was question number 1? Question number 1 was, I tell my shaliach to sell an acre. And what does he do? He sells 2. This is how this whole thing got started. What was the shayla? How do I view his actions? Remember again the 2 words. Is he mosif, adding on to the shlichos, or over, in violation of the terms of the shlichos, in which case the shlichos is void? The Rambam paskins. So again, I asked him to sell an acre, he sells 2. Harezem mosif al dvarav, the kana halokeach beis sa'a bilvad. We view the shliach as being mosif. So therefore he's adding on the shlichus, therefore is still good. Now both say, obviously the shlichus is only good for what? For what? For the acre I told him to sell, right? Obviously you can't sell something that the owner did not grant you permission to sell. So halacha l'maisa, the shlichus is good for the 1 acre. Beautiful. That's case 1. Case 2. I tell the shliach to sell 2 acres, and what? He sells 1 acre. So Amar lo macharli beis sasai macharlo beis sa'a harezia ma'avir al dvarav v'lo kana lokea. I'll say fascinating. In that case, the shlichus is batal, because the shliach is considered to be in violation of the terms of the agency. Why? You see from here that what? That the halacha understands, I want the shliach to sell 2 acres, not 1 acre, because I don't want a proliferation of shtaros. The fact that the shliach went ahead and violated that instruction voids the entire shlichus. Okay, last case. Amar lo macharli sadala adam echad. It will say, if halacha l'maisa, I say, sell the field to 1 person, and the shliach sells the field to multiple people, ultimately, shlichus is void. What happens if I just tell him, go ahead and sell the field, but I don't articulate to how many purchasers? In that case, the shaliach has the right to go, has the flexibility to sell it to as many people as he wants. Beautiful. I will say that is all the halacha l'maisa of the previous sugya. Mishnah. Shuma dayan shepich sushtos shisos o hosifu shisos. We'll say very interesting case here. Normally the halachos of onah, we mentioned this yesterday, halachos of onah center around a 1/6. Right? If you overcharge by a 1/6, undercharge by a 1/6, ultimately that is grounds for the voiding of a transaction. Now we have seen that there is no onah by karka, no onah by real property, and again that has to do with the nature of real estate. Fine. Now this is an interesting case. Shoma Dayan, we'll say, what say Beis Din is selling off property? Yeah, very simple case. Right? Beis Din is going ahead and selling off property, ultimately again to, let's say, satisfy a Kesuvos or for any other debt. It doesn't really make a difference. The point over here is Beis Din is the one who is doing the valuation and ultimately the sale. So Shuma Dayan shepich sushasus or hosifu shisus. Let's say, we'll say the Beis Din, they went ahead and either they overvalued or undervalued the property by a 1/6. What's talacha? Michran batal. So we'll say Tanakama says that even a Beis Din is subject to the halachos of onah. So if in selling off property they go ahead and overcharge, undercharge a 1/6, ultimately again the transaction is void. Rav Shimon says Michran kayim. Rav Shimon says absolutely not. Even if Beis Din overcharges or undercharges by a 1/6, ultimately again the transaction stands. Why? Im came ma koach Beis Din yafa. Because the Gemara says over here, because otherwise, what good is Beis Din? What good is Beis Din? In other words, it's actually a fascinating idea. Meaning what the Gemara is saying is like this, is what makes Beis Din is that they're not proclamations, but their rulings stand. If you're going to start overturning rulings of Beis Din, then what power does Beis Din really have? Aval, im asa igeres bikoras beinehem, afilu machron shava mana b'masayim, or shava masayim b'mana, machron kayim. However, halacha l'maisa, if Beis Din made an igeres bikoras, now what's an igeres bikoras? Rashi says over here, hachroza, v'lashon bikoras, if Beis Din announced the sale of the property, and it fetched some type of weird market price. For example, you ended up selling a field that was worth 100 for 200 or 200 for 100. In that case, everyone agrees that the sale stands. Why? Because since it was announced, this is what the market fetched. Now I will say, so you have a fundamental machlokes over here. So Tanakama holds that Beis Din is subject to the laws of onah, overcharging and undercharging. Shulami says, absolutely not. They are exempt. Whatever Beis Din does always stands, because otherwise you fundamentally erode the power of Beis Din. It says the Gemara Bailahu Shliach Kaman. So I'll say this is fascinating. So I'll say, so now we have 2 models, right? We have 2 models. We have the Beis Din model and the Almana model, right? So remember again, the Beis Din model, at least according to Rav Shimon Gamliel, or actually I should say even according to Tanakama, is that as long as you're not undercharging or overcharging by more or less than a 1/6, what's the status of Beis Din's transaction? What's the status? Valid. Everyone agrees to that. Contrast that with the almana. What was the case of the almana? If the almana overcharges, or I should say undersells by even the smallest amount, right? She takes a field that's worth 101 zuz, and she sells it for 1 zuz. What's talacha? The sale is void. So now the Gemara asks, Ibailuhu, shliach kiman. Who is the shaliach like? Is the shaliach like an almana, and therefore no margin of error? Or the shaliach is like Beis Din, some margin of error? So top of Kuf, Rava Rav Nachman shliach kedayanin. So Rav is saying Rav Nachman that a shaliach is like a Beis Din, is like dayanin. Rav Shmuel bar Bisna Rav Nachman ke'almana. Rav Shmuel bar Bisna said in the name of Rav Nachman, no, the shaliach is like an almana. So let's analyze. Rava Rav Nachman shliach kedayanin. So Rava said in Rav Nachman that a shaliach is like dayanin, and therefore the shaliach himself also has a sixth margin, up to a sixth margin of error. Mad dayan lav ledido, af shliach nami lav ledido. Just like the dayanim, they're not selling their own property. In other words, they're not doing something for themselves. They're trying to go ahead and help another. So too, the shaliach is not selling for himself. He is trying to help another as well. La fuke almana ledidei. Contrast this with the case of an almana, right? An almana ultimately again is selling it for herself. Rav Shmuel bar Bisna Rav Nachman ke'almana. Rav Shmuel bar Bisna said no, that the shliach is like an almana. Why? Ma almana yichida, af shliach yochid. Just like an almana is an individual, a shliach is also an individual. La fuke Beis Din de rabbininu. To exclude a Beis Din, that a Beis Din is not a yochid. A Beis Din is a rabbin. Beis Din is a rabbin. Okay, and what's the halacha? The hilchasa shliach ke'almana. Ultimately, again, the shaliach, the Gemara says the halacha is the shaliach is like an almana. Therefore, Rabbi say, so essentially, what we have over here is as follows. When it comes so far, a shaliach and an almana who make any mistake transactionally, that voids their transaction. That voids their transaction. A Beis Din, everyone is agreeing that there is some margin of error acceptable within a Beis Din. The machlokas is how much of a margin of error. Okay, why is this different than the following case? Homer the shlucha, we just actually mentioned this in the previous sugya. Homer the shlucha v'tzei. I say to my shaliach, tithe my produce. Torah kedas balabayis. The shaliach should tithe in accordance with what he knows my tithing practice to be. What happens if the shaliach does not know my tithing practice? Then what's the halacha? Torah bebeinonis. Ultimately, again, he should take the middle approach. Echad mechamishim, 1/50th. So in other words, the shaliach doesn't know if I'm a generous guy, 1/40th, or a stingy guy, 1/60th. So therefore, what should he do? Take the middle ground, 1/50th. I piches asara ohosif asara. What happens if he adds a tenth, subtracts a tenth? What's talacha? Truma so truma. The truma is still good. Truma is still good. Okay, so we'll say, so what do you see from here? That a shaliach does have some flexibility. Right? You see from here that a shaliach does have some level of flexibility. So what's going on over here? Hasam kevan de ikad determined by ayin ra, ikad determined by ayin yofa. Amarle lahachi am deticha. Avahacha ta'usuhu. So we'll say it's very interesting. There's a difference between a range and a mistake. I will say, so for the case of truma, there is an objective range in which people tithe, right? And it ranges from 1/40th to 1/60th. So if the shaliach goes ahead, so right, let's say I tell the shaliach, go ahead and tithe my produce. It happens to be, I'm a 1/50th guy, middle of the road. The shaliach tithes me at 1/40th. Say, oh, you made a mistake. He said, listen, I didn't make a mistake. Even if I made a mistake, my mistake is still what? In the acceptable range. Okay, I didn't know your exact practices, but we're close enough. I will say, that's different than a mistake. So for example, with the shaliach to go ahead and take a field that's worth 100 zuz, 101 zuz, and sell it for 100, that's a mistake. So halacha l'maisa, the Gemara says, when there's a range, so okay, the shaliach is allowed to operate in that range. That's fine. But a mistake ultimately goes ahead and voids his shlichos immediately. Amrlei loy boy lechalamiti. Because I could always say to a shaliach, I did not engage you to make a mistake. In other words, we'll say, we have this refrain, "L'takuni shadartich v'lo la'avusi." I sent you to help me, not to harm me. So the shlichus is only intact when ultimately it provides a service to the mishaleach. But the moment that the shlichus comes and puts me at a disadvantage, by definition, it is dissolved. So the Gemara goes right to Amrav Funa Bachanina Amrav Nachman. Halacha kedivrei chachamim. The halacha follows the chacham. So therefore, Rabbi say, remember again, the chacham in the Mishnah hold that halacha lamaisa, Beis Din could make a mistake in the valuation of property up to what? Up to a sixth. So comes along, Rav Huna Bar Chanina says in the name of Rav Nachman that the halacha follows the chachamim. Good. So the Gemara says, "Let's later Rav Nachman Makwach Beis in Yafa." Rabbi say, 1 second. What about what Rav Shimon Gamliel is raising? Rabbi say, because again, remember, Rav Shimon Gamliel is saying it's not true. The actions of a Beis Din have to stand. So I will say this is actually fascinating because let's play this out for just a moment. Let's say Beis Din, right? Let's say, for example, Reuven died, left behind Rachel. Beis Din needs to step in to sell off properties to go ahead and satisfy Rachel's ksuba. So Beis Din steps in. It turns out that they totally misvalued the properties. Totally misvalued it. So now let's say again they undersold it by a third, right? So now Rav Shimon Gamliel is saying that halacha l'maisa, their sale, their transaction still stands. Now we'll say what's going on over here. So if you notice, by the way, there's a fundamental tension. What's the tension? On one hand, what they did puts the estate at a disadvantage. On the other hand, if you overturn their ruling, what does that do? That fundamentally undermines the effectiveness of Beis Din. So essentially what we have over here is there's a clash between the needs of the individuals, in this case the Yisomim, versus the needs of the collective, the community. The community needs Beis Din to be strong and needs Beis Din's rulings to be viewed as unchallengeable. The individual needs the ruling overturned. So essentially what Rav Shimon Gamliel is saying is the needs of the community always trump the needs of the individual. That is so that's what it means when it says Im Kein Makoach Beis Din Yafa. What are you doing to the power of Beis Din if you start overturning their rulings? So does Rav Nachman not subscribe to that idea? Rav Nachman will say first white line, Yisomim shabal lachlok b'nichsei avihem, right? If Yisomim come to go ahead and divide up their father's estate, Beis Din ma'amidalan apotropos uboralam chilek yafa. So we'll say, so Beis Din goes ahead and establishes for each of them an apotropos, an executor, right? And ultimately, again, and the executor helps each of them find their correct portion. Higdilu, if the Yisomim get older, when they get older, Yicholim limchos, they have the ability to object to the portion they received. Rav Nachman Rav Nachman himself says, Higdilu, and Yicholim limchos. So we'll say Rav Nachman himself says, no, when they get older, they cannot object. As the famous adage goes, you get what you get. Right? So once they got their portion, they don't have the right to object. Why? Because Imkain Makoach Beis Din Yafa. Because we'll say, otherwise, what is the good of Beis Din? Right? If Beis Din's rulings could be overturned, then wherein lies the effectiveness of Beis Din? So we'll say, so what do you see from here? Rav Nachman himself does hold Imkain Makoach Beis Din Yafa. If that's the case, then why would he allow the ruling to be overturned over here in the Mishnah? To which the Gemara says, not a kasha, lo kasha, hadito, hadaloto. Rav Nachman says it's not a fair case. There's a difference between a case where Beis Din makes a mistake versus where Beis Din didn't make a mistake. In our Mishnah, if they're overselling or underselling by more than a sixth, they'll say, what is that? That's a mistake. Mistakes are overturnable, which is a good life lesson. Right? In this case over here by the Yisomim, they're not making a mistake. If they're not making a mistake, idlo tov ma'yichon limchos. I will say, if ultimately they didn't make a mistake, so when the Yisomim get older, what are they able to object to or object about? To which the Gemara says, Baruchos. Ultimately, again, because when they get older, the Yisomim could say, we didn't want it in the north, we wanted it in the south. In other words, the division is fine, but they're unhappy about where they received the land. So in that case, Rav Nachman says, look, that's it. Beis Din made a decision. Im Kein Makoach Beis Din Yafa. In the Mishnah's case, the Gemara is saying over here, Rav Nachman is saying over here, this is a mistake. right? When it comes to a mistake, even the rulings of Beis Din can be overturned. What about Imkein Ma Koach Beis Din Yafa? So Rav Nachman will say the job of Beis Din ultimately, again, is deliver MS, is to deliver truth. So if what they did is wrong, that has to be overturned. Kiyasa Rav Dimi Amar, Maisa v'asa Rabbi K'divrei Chachamim. Rav Dimi said, there was a Maisa and Rabbi Paskin like the Chachamim. Amar the fun of Parta Benosh Rabbi Elazar ben Parta, Ben Benosh Rabbi Parta Agadol Imkein Ma Koach Beis Din Yafa. So again, Parta said to Rabbi, if you overturn the rulings of Beis Din, Ma Koach Beis Din Yafa, then ultimately, again, what power does Beis Din have? V'hechzir Rabbi es hamaisa. And Rabbi went ahead and didn't overturn the ruling. Rav Dimi Masni Hachi, Rav Safra Masni Hachi. Maisa ubikesh Rabbi Lasos Kedir Cham. So also in Rabbi Safra, in Rav Safra's model, Rabbi didn't pass like the Chum. He was ready to pass like the Chumim. Amar the fun the part of Benosh Rabbi Elazar part of Ben Benosh part Agadol Imkein Ma Koach Beis Din Yafa. V'lo asa Rabbi es hamayis, and Rabbi didn't act. Okay, so we'll say two different versions. In version 1, he passed like the Chum and then reversed. In version 2, he was about to pass like the Chum but didn't end up doing so. So we'll say, so again, we have a fundamental machlokes over here between the Tanakama and Reb Shimon Gamliel. Beis Din sold properties and they messed up. They undersold or oversold by more than a sixth. In that case, Tanakama says, reverse their ruling. Reversing, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, no, Imkein Ma Koach Beis Din Yafa. Leave it as it is. We have a vested interest in a strong Beis Din. Strong Beis Din means that their rulings must be respected. And sometimes for their rulings to be respected, you have to even leave the erroneous ones intact. Says the Gemara, what are they arguing about? So Mar Tavar, here we go. Tab Dvar Mishnah Chozer, Umar Savar Eina Chozer. Suppose this is very interesting. We're going to see now that there are different types of mistakes that a Beis Din makes. There's what's called Torah B'Dvar Mishnah. Torah B'Dvar Mishnah means when a Beis Din makes a mistake in an explicit ruling. Explicit ruling, right? Something that's not contested. So maybe their argument, or we'll say over here, is like this. That maybe the machlokes is, when Beis Din makes a mistake in an explicit ruling, is that reversible or not? To which the Gemara says, Lo, D'chuli Alma Torah B'Dvar Mishnah Chozer. Everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa, if Beis Din makes a mistake in an explicit ruling. So we'll say this is very important. Everyone agrees if Beis Din's mistake is clear, everyone knows it, everyone sees it, chozer, that is a reversible ruling. So the Gemara says, Umar Savar Hachi Havamaisa, Umar Savar Hachi Havamaisa. So we'll say it could be very well over here that interestingly enough, the machlokes is what we call when Beis Din is toa b'shikol hadas. Shikol hadas means something that's an opinion. That's an opinion. That requires an opinion, that requires an assessment. So then Beis Din makes a quote-unquote mistake. Then there's a machlokes. Whether or not such a ruling is reversible. So the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says the machlokes over here is in the story, in Maisa, what happened? What is it? Torah B'Dvar Mishnah, not a Torah B'Dvar Mishnah. Okay, Rav Yosef, Armalta Dizvina, Achraya Seyasmi. It was a very interesting case. If an almana sells off property in order to, so I just want to point out, this machlokes is still hovering over here. We haven't resolved it yet, and it is a fundamental machlokes. So machlokes number 1 is really whether or not the erroneous rulings of Beis Din are overturnable. Tanakama says yes, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says no. Machlokes is rooted in what? Imkein ma koach Beis Din yafa. Are we concerned about the fundamental erosion of the authority of Beis Din or not? There's now a sub-discussion as well about what type of rulings are we talking about. Are we talking about Torah B'Dvar Mishnah, where Beis Din makes a mistake in an explicit Mishnah, or Torah B'Shikol Hadas, something that is an opinion? Okay, we'll come back to that as well. Now I'm jumping a little bit. Rav Yosef, Armalta Zvina, Achraya Sayasmi. Very interesting case. If an almana sells off property to satisfy her ksuba, the achrayas, the responsibility for the sale is on who? The yisomim. So we'll say, what does that mean? So let's just play this out. Rachel's widowed. She's selling off property for her ksuba. She sells off a parcel of land to party A. It turns out that her deceased husband had a creditor. So what happens? The creditor comes now and seizes the property from purchaser A. Who does A go back to? Who does A go back to? Not the almana. He goes back to the yisomim, which are the estate. The estate. Or Beis Din Dezamin, when Beis Din sells property, achrayas hayasmi. Also, same idea. If Beis Din is selling off property, again, to satisfy the debts of the estate, who has the achrayas? The yisomim. So pshita, this is obvious. To which the Gemara says, pshita, amana lo estrichale. You're right, the case of the almana is obvious. Ki itzrich le beidina. So here's what's interesting. The novelty case is the Beis Din. That when Beis Din sells off property, ultimately again to take care of the debts of the estate, that the responsibility, the achrayus for the sale, rests upon the yisomim, the estate. Because I would have thought what? Ma'udetema, what would you have thought? Amud Beis, Ma'udetema, Kol Dezabim Medina, Daita Lemeifach Leikala, Hu Dezabim. So I would have thought like this. When Beis Din sells something, by definition there's a kol, right? There's so much publicity that centers around that sale, that is like buying with achrayus from the Beis Din. Kamash Malono. Kamash Malono said that even though a Beis Din sells something, even though hopefully there is a call, l'maisa, if there's a problem, ultimately again the achrayus goes back against the yisomim. Incredible. Rav Shimon Gamliel. So what's Rav Shimon Gamliel says? Now we'll say back to the Mishnah. So what did Rav Shimon Gamliel say? Remember again, Rav Shimon Gamliel held that halacha l'maisa, even if Beis Din undersells by more than a sixth or less than a sixth, the sale is still valid because imkein mak koach Beis Din yafa. The Gemara asks a very interesting question. The ad kama. So we'll say even in Rav Shimon Gamliel's model, is there an error that is so egregious, right, so blatant that it would cause the voiding of the transaction? Rav Shimon Gamliel. So I'm going to yes, ad palga, up until a half. In other words, I will say, if you go ahead and you miss the mark by 50% or more, then even Rav Shimon Gamliel would agree that halacha l'maisa, that's grounds for avoiding of the transaction. Tanya Nami Achia Bryce that supports this. Avram Gamliel, Beis Din shemachru shava masayim b'moneh, o shava moneh b'masayim michran kayim. So we'll say, so ultimately again, halacha l'maisa, say, see it over here, Beis Din that sold the property that was worth 200 for 100, or 100 for 200, their sale is valid. So we'll say, so that's up to, right? In other words, so the Gemara says, ad palgo. Good. Amramei, Mishmeid Rav Yosef, Beis Din shemakro below achraza, na'asu kimishetol b'dvar mishnah v'chozrin. So we'll say, very interesting case. If Beis Din sells without announcing, now we'll say, in general, you want to go ahead and make a hachraza. You want to announce a sale of property before you sell. Why? Because like I said, that attracts attention. When again, attracting attention will hopefully drive up the price. What happens if Beis Din sells without hachraza? They just make the sale, but they never announce the sale beforehand. Nasu kimishatol b'dvar mishnah v'chozrin. Very interesting. This is the equivalent. Ultimately, again, to going ahead and making a mistake in an explicit ruling. And what's the halacha when you make a mistake in an explicit ruling? Ultimately, again, the sale is void. The transaction is void. Nasu, so the Gemara says, Nasu vadaito. So we'll say, ultimately, if you look at Rashi over here, no, not yet. So Rashi says, Nasu b'tmiya havadaito hadar shenishim. So we'll say, the lashon over here is, Nasu, they are as if they made a mistake in an explicit ruling. So the Gemara says, as if they made a mistake, vadaito, they did make a mistake. This nan, shum hayisum shloshim yom. Rabbi says, it's very interesting. When going ahead and valuating property, ultimately, again, Rashi says, I'm sorry, not yet. So when you're going, you sell property off to satisfy debts of the yisomim. Right? So what's the halacha? 30 days. 30 days. You announce it. In other words, shum literally means evaluation. What it means is we let the property sit on the market for 30 days to create a call, shum ha'hekdish, shishim yom. If you're selling off property for hekdish, you allow it to sit on the market, right, for 60 days in order, again, to create the call, in order to create the publicity. Umachrizin baboker uba'erev. And ultimately, we announce about the sale of the property in the morning and in the evening. So therefore, Rabbi say, if Beis Din goes ahead and sells, right? If Beis Din sells ultimately without what? If Beis Din sells halacha l'maisa, again, without any type of announcement, that's to'ah b'dvar mishnah. right? That's making a mistake in an explicit ruling. To which the Gemara says, Imeahi, because if it would have just been from that case or from that statement, Hava Amina, Hani Mili Shaliach. That's true ultimately again when the Shaliach. So if a Shaliach sells without making an announcement, then that's Torah B'dvar Mishnah, that voids the Shlichus. Aval Beis Din lo. But maybe when Beis Din sells, Beis Din doesn't need to make an announcement. Kamash Malon, that Beis Din needs to announce also before they make a sale. And if Beis Din sells without a prior announcement, that is the equivalent of Torah B'dvar Mishnah, making a mistake with an explicit ruling, and ultimately the transaction is void. Say Rav Ashi Meimar. So Rav Ashi raised the kasha to Meimar. Shum hadayanim shepech sushtos o sisushasos. If ultimately again the dayanim went ahead and evaluated something, right, and they either overpriced it by a 6 or underpriced it by a 6, michran batal. Their sale is batal. Hashave b'shave michran kayim. Ultimately, but if they sell it for the right price, their transaction is good. My love the lo achrus. Are we not talking about a case where as long as they sell it for the right price, even if what? Even if they didn't announce the sale ahead of time, the sale is still good. To which the Gemara says, my love the lo achrus, lo b'da achrus. No, we're talking about a case where they announced the sale. So the Gemara says, 1 second. Habi the sefer b'da achrus, havi reisha b'da lo achrus. But again, if the sefer is going to be talking about a case where they announced it, then the pashtos the reisha is talking about a case where they didn't announce it. Diktani sefer im asu igeres bikores. If they went ahead of us, I remember again, and made this igeres bikores has made the announcement. Afilu machru shaveh manam masayim. Even if they sold the field for 200 zuz, for 100 zuz, oh shaveh masayim or 200 zuz for 100 zuz, michran kayim. So that's the case of Osai where they made the announcement. Elali olam b'dalo achras. Rather, they must be talking about a case in the Reisha where they didn't announce it. V'lo kasha kan b'dvarim shemachrizin alein kan b'dvarim she'emachrizin. We'll say, here we go. So Gemara says it's fascinating. You don't make announcements for the sale of every single type of piece of property. There are certain things for which you announce where if Beis Din did not do it, that's called Torah b'dvar Mishnah. That's called making a mistake in an explicit ruling, which is grounds to void the transaction. But then there are other examples of things that you do not announce before you sell it. For example, ve'eluhein dvarim she'machrizin alein. Rabbi says it's fascinating. Here are examples of things that you do not announce before selling. For example, so the Gemara says ha'avadim, ha'metaltalin, ha'shtaros. I will say slaves, movable property, and documents. What does this mean? Avadim, taimamai, shemi yishmu v'yivrachu. Very interesting. You don't announce the sale of avadim before their sale. Why? Because they may hear and what? Run away. Metaltalin ushtaros. You don't announce the metaltal ushtaros. Why not? Shemi yignevu. So we'll say, so sometimes if people hear about this stuff, right, too often what's going to happen? They're going to come and they're going to go ahead and steal it. Vibai sema. Kan b'shash shemachrizin, kan b'shash she'im machrizin. I will say, or the other possibility is that sometimes there are times that we go ahead and announce. Sometimes we don't announce. What does this mean? Darin ardoi lekarga lemizori lekvura mezabninon below askarta achrasta. I will say for certain things, because there is an immediate need, you have to sell it off even without announcing. For example, karga Rabbi says the king's head tax, mizonos is food, kvura is burial. There are certain needs that are immediate and emergent needs, and therefore you don't have the luxury of announcing and seeing what something fetches on the open market. You just have to get the job done now. The other possibility is kan b'makom shemachrizin, kan b'makom she'emachrizin. They both say there are some places where they would announce, some places where they wouldn't announce. The Rav Nachman may olam lo asu igaris bikaris benarda. Ultimately, again, Rav Nachman said, for example, they never have say announced property sales, or for that matter, sales in Narda. Maybe because in Narda they were expert in assessing property, so they didn't need to go ahead and make the announcement, put it on the open market to see what the price would be. They both say this is very interesting. In Narda, the reason why they did not go ahead and announce sales of property by Beis Din is something very interesting. When is Beis Din usually selling property? When there's some type of ongoing issue, right? There's some type of issue. There's debts, there's this. There's a little bit sometimes of an embarrassment when buying property from Beis Din because it looks like you may be exploiting the situation of someone else. Right? Someone else is having difficulty. That's why Beis Din is selling off the property. And what am I doing? I'm swooping in and taking advantage of someone else's tsaros. So often people would be a bit reticent to step into property sales like that, but yet we need people to buy that property. So I will say, so in Arda, they stopped announcing property because they would call people, these people are consuming the property of the announcement. In other words, it was a derogatory term. Therefore, in Arda, interestingly enough, see, I will say, it's fascinating. Normally, the reason you announce property sales is why? To make sure you have buyers. In Narda, they would not announce property sales in order to what? Make sure they entice proper interest. So I also have to stop over here for today. Shkoyach. All right, Avram Zysman, everyone have a wonderful, wonderful Shabbos. Dr. Lussman, great to see you. Amish Allen, great to see you. David, wonderful to see you. Our whole Eretz Yisrael contingent. Baruch Hashem. A good night, everyone. A good Erev Shabbos. I'm sorry. Thank you. Good Shabbos, good to see you.